His shelves were lined with books written by the likes of Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Voltaire, and Jean-Paul Sartre. It's not exactly light reading you would expect to find on most bookshelves in any home, much less when these bookshelves are in the cell at the New Jersey State Prison. I got to know Kamanga in 1992 and 93. At the time, I was a middler. I was in the middle part of my program at Princeton Seminary, and I spent the better part of a year going to New Jersey State Prison in Trenton twice a week, visiting with inmates. Kamanga became one of my favorite people to go and talk to, again, because most people don't have their bookshelves lined with Jean-Paul Sartre and Soren Kierkegaard, much less in prison. Kamanga was born in Ghana, later educated in Brussels and Paris. He knew 7 languages, including French. He came to the U.S., like so many, trying to better his life, find new opportunities. He freely admitted to me he did something illegal coming to the U.S. He met a young woman, proposed to her so that he could become an American citizen. He was quite open and upfront about that. After he met this young woman and married her, that's when the story went off the track. And after a number of things that he did, he found himself at the New Jersey State Prison for life. While I lived in Louisiana, I spent 2 years traveling once a month to Angola State Penitentiary. At one time, one of the bloodiest and worst state prisons you could spend time in. It is improved, but is still not, of course, the kind of place you want to spend your time in. And so while I have never done time in prison, I have spent considerable time in prison. But before I begin talking about prison, I do want to be upfront and say something very clearly. It would be easy for me to romanticize my visits with prisoners. It would be very easy for me to do that because, you see, at the end of the day, I always could walk out the front door and return to my home, to my family, and to my bed. So I don't want to overly romanticize my time in prison. But having spent the better part of 3 years in prison, it's amazing that many of the conversations I had with inmates were very similar. Time and time again, they kept going back to this notion that they sit in a cell and they watch the world pass them by. Now, this is not the time to have a political conversation about why people are in jail, etc. Many of the people who are in jail are there for very good reasons, but yet their experience is what I want to talk about. Their experience is sitting in a cell and they look out a small window and they see the world and life passing them by, and they are utterly powerless to do anything about the world beyond their reach. I mention prisons because it is something we hear about in our gospel story. The temptation is to move ahead to what Jesus says and what Jesus does. That's always the temptation in the Gospels, right? And sometimes we forget in the black letters on the white page a reality that some people are living with. John the Baptizer, the one we just heard from last week, John sitting in a prison cell. And John is not just doing a life sentence. John is on death row because fairly soon John will pay for his preaching He will pay for his truth-telling in his very own life. So John is sitting there on death row, as we would equate it. And John sends word out from his own disciples. John, who had his own ministry, John, who had his own gig, John, who might have been the rector of the Jericho Episcopal Church, John, who had his own gig, is now sitting in prison. And he has to ask his own disciples to go out and ask Jesus, I'm hearing all this stuff. Are you the one we're expecting? Or should we be looking for another? I've thought a lot about Kamanga this past week. I think of him from time to time, and what I realize is that I have not seen him for 20 years. I think about all I have done in 20 years, all the places I've lived, all the relationships I have formed, all the wonderful things that I've been able to experience in 20 years. And I think Kamanga has never left that cell. He is still there 20 years later. John, the baptizer, the evangelist, the prophet, the one we just heard from last week, all of this is happening outside the prison walls, and there is not a thing he can do about it. So he has to send his disciples out to ask Jesus, are you the one we've been expecting, or should we just move on to the next person? This sense when you are in a prison that life is moving on ahead of you without you, and there's not much you can do about it. In the first century, there were all sorts of expectations about the Messiah, the Son of God, God on earth. There were all sorts of expectations about what this Messiah would be and do. And it would be very easy for me to say that everyone expected the Messiah to ride into town, ride in Jerusalem with an army and overthrow the occupying forces known as the Roman army. It would be very simple to paint that brush that way. That is partly true, but it was very complicated because everyone in the first century, I dare say like us, had all sorts of expectations of what the Messiah would do, what the Messiah would be, what the Messiah would even look like. Who is this one from God who will usher in God's kingdom? All sorts of questions about that. And so here is John, hearing these early reports. And he sends a question, are you the one? Or should we go find someone else? Think about it. Last week we heard from John. And what did John tell us last week? I'm taking the axe out, and I'm taking the axe to the root of the tree. And let me tell you about the Messiah. The Messiah who is coming after me has a winnowing fork in his hand. He has a winnowing fork, and he's getting rid of the chaff. He's separating the good from the bad, and the bad he is sending into the unquenchable fire. That's what we last hear from John. And now here John is in prison. And while, of course, I was not there to hear from John, I suspect what he might have heard is something like this. You know what, John? That Messiah you preached about and talked about, that Messiah who's coming to lay the axe at the root of the tree, you know what he's doing? He is spending a whole lot of time with the invalid. For Pete's sake, he's spending time with people who can't even walk. He's spending time with people who can't see. He's spending time with people who can't talk. He's spending time with prostitutes, gluttons, drunkards, sinners, tax collectors. How is this for the campaign to be the Messiah? And here is John in a prison cell. His ministry done for, his life nearly done for. And this is what he's hearing about the Messiah. Are you the one we're to be looking for? Or should we just move on to the next gig and find the next person? That is kind of where John is. You all will remember a number of years ago this fad. People who wore bracelets, and if you wore these bracelets, I don't mean to offend you, but there was a fad that people would wear these bracelets, WWJD. What would Jesus do? That question's been around for a couple of thousand years. The question might have been, what would the Messiah have done? WWMD. And this is the question John and so many people in the first century are getting at, because their expectations of what the Messiah would do and be about, their prayers for the Messiah, their hopes and dreams of what the Messiah would do to deliver them was a different picture, a different person when Jesus showed up on the scene. And here they are trying to reconcile their hopes and dreams and their prayers with the reality of this Messiah. My suspicion is that all these dreams and hopes and prayers for the Messiah we dream of may not really be the Messiah who shows up and proclaims God's kingdom. Out of all due respect to many of you in this congregation, the kingdom of God is not hatched in the Pentagon. The kingdom of God is not hatched in our imagination and in our wishes and our dreams and our demands for what God's kingdom and God's rule would look like. We all, for 2,000 years, have prayed for, dreamed of, even still today in Jerusalem, what this Messiah would be like, what the world would look like around us when this Messiah comes. We, in just 9 days, will be moving to sweet baby Jesus. And moving toward this sweet baby Jesus, like they did 2,000 years ago. We had our own set of expectations, dreams, and wishes for what this baby would deliver for all of us. So imagine you've given your life in your ministry. You have literally given your life. You're on death row, about to give your life for proclaiming the day of the Messiah, the day of the Lord. The Son of God is here. And then he goes and he spends his time with those who have trouble walking, with those who have trouble talking, with those who can't hear and can't see, with those who have spurious reputations in the neighborhood. That's who the Messiah goes and he spends his time with. So this is what John hears from the prison cell. Powerless to do anything about it. When he sends his disciples out, he hears back, not that the Messiah is delivering with his army, The Pentagon is not sending in the army to overthrow Rome and to deliver the Jewish state. Folks are healed. The poor are given their due recognition. So what is it we are waiting for? Just 9 days from sweet baby Jesus entering our world, reminding us that God shows up in our world. What is it we are waiting for? What is it we are expecting baby Jesus to deliver for us? Are you the one who is to come? Or should we just move along and find someone else? Are you the one who is to come? Or should we just move along and find someone else?